Now, the political conversation this week has largely been dominated by the maiden speech of Fraser Anning and the contentious National Energy Guarantee. And in the latest development, the Prime Minister has seemingly changed his position by signalling the emissions targets may be regulated rather than legislated.
Well, to discuss this and other topics making news this week, we're talking with Liberal MP Craig Kelly and Labor MP Pat Conroy in Newcastle. Welcome to both of you.
Great to be with you on this Saturday morning.
So, Craig, this drop last night, so the Prime Minister now, as far as the NEG is concerned and those emissions targets, rather than legislate it, regulate it. Does it have your support?
Well, as always, I reserve my right until I see the final details of the policy. One thing when it comes to regulation or legislation, I know that the Labor state governments were demanding that we actually have this by regulation. Now, the difference is, if you have it in the targets in legislation, for a future government to change those targets, it would have to pass both houses of parliament. That's how democracy should work. If you want to make such a substantial change to that, to our economy, I believe you should firstly have to get it through the parliament. If you do it by regulation, you are setting up a mechanism where the minister, virtually at a stroke of a pen, can change the targets. Now, I know that was a line in the sand for many of us, and I know many of the Labor states have been arguing they want it in regulation, so I'm really waiting to see what the full detail of this is.
So it sounds like you don't support this change then?
If it's to change it actually if it's to put being able to change the target in a regulation, this would actually take it further away than what I could actually support.
So why did he do it?
We'd have to, it's not a question for me to ask or for me to answer.
But you'll be asking the Prime Minister, obviously.
Yeah, look, there'll obviously be further debate on this in the Coalition Party room come Tuesday.
Okay, Pat Conroy, is this in your interest? And we were asking your colleague Ed Husick a little earlier as to whether this plays in Labor's favour, because obviously a future Labor government would make it easier for you to increase those targets.
Well, we'll examine the detail when we get to see the revised draft legislation, because the legislation that we'd received is already out of date because of this policy fiasco. But what is clear is that Malcolm Turnbull has surrendered yet again to the Conservative wing of the Liberal Party. His leadership is now totally an abject failure. He's clearly a puppet. He couldn't even get the party room to support the inadequate 26% emissions reduction target, so he's having to put it in regulations because he was going to have well over a dozen Liberal MPs cross the floor and not vote for it. So this, again, is just demonstrating that Malcolm Turnbull is a puppet of the hard right of the Liberal Party, and again we've got a fiasco of energy policy. We won't have certainty because who knows what they're going to change next when the hard right say to Malcolm Turnbull, that's not enough, we need something else. And this is just shambolic policy making on top of shambolic policy making.
Craig, for the Prime Minister, does this solve the problem of potentially that group of coalition MPs crossing the floor?
Well, as I said, we and many of my other colleagues that actually supported the NEG previously, if they now find that this is actually going to be able to be the targets increased by regulation, some of them may even actually reconsider their position. But just on
when you say some of them, you included.
Well, this is a concern that I had. This has been an additional concern that I had. But look, Pat goes on. We have debates on our side of politics. We're not the Labor Party. We all frog march in and sort of stand there and nod your head and say yes. We have real debates in the party room, and we should never shy away from that. I think this is some weakness. We should look at this as a strength of the coalition, to have vigorous debates about, because that's the way we get the best policy. We don't get the best policy where everyone's standing there and nodding their head and go, yes, 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 I agree. It is vigorous debates is the only way, especially in this area of policy, when there's been so many mistakes made before, which has pushed electricity prices higher than anywhere else in the world. That's why we have to have vigorous debates on it. And I don't refrain from that at all.
But Craig, isn't that part of the problem with energy policy over the past 10 years, that there's just been debate from two extremes rather than people actually trying to find a compromise?
Well, we've had a compromise. We've had the renewable energy target, which this year, that was a compromise policy. The target was initiated under Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard. It was then, by consent, the target was reduced because it was deemed as too high. That this year will add $3.6 billion onto the cost of people's electricity bill. That's been the problem in the past. Now, let's have this debate. Let's have this vigorous as we can, because we have to get this right. Electricity prices in this nation are completely unacceptable.
Pat, you wanted to jump in?
Craig, I need to respond to a number of factual inaccuracies there by Craig. First off, the government's own review found that renewable energy target reduces power prices.
That's worked well, Pat. That's gone really well.
Them. And in fact,
they come down, yes, Pat.
And in fact, the government's own, Craig, I'll let you have
That's
a go.
why they got it wrong.
Now.
It was wrong
and
in the
fact,
past.
The government's modelling around the Craig, in fact, the government's own modelling around the NEG found that 400 of the purported $550 of savings comes from the massive renewable investment that's occurring at the tail end of the renewable energy target put in place by Labor. That's my first point. Investment in renewable energy leads to lower power prices and cleans up our emissions.
Where in the world has that happened?
The Labor Party is being attacked by both the Liberal Party and the Greens. We're taking a moderate position on this, but if Malcolm Turnbull can't even get support for his inadequate 26% emissions reduction target through his own party room, why does he even bother getting up in the morning? He can't even get a commitment to the government's own target, a target they entered into in 2015 as part of the Paris Accord through his own party room. This is what this back down is all about.
Pat,
this
why not?
Is about. He
Why
has
not
no
back it then?
confidence that his party room will support a 26% reduction target legislated, so he's having to do it by regulation. This is abject surrender by Malcolm Turnbull yet again.
Pat, why does the Labor Party back it then? And then if you have confidence of winning the next election, you can increase it.
Well, we've been positive about the NEG. We recognise that we do need a framework that is bipartisan in nature. We can have disagreements about targets, but as long as there's a bipartisan agreement about the framework, that will help reduce uncertainty in the energy sector and thereby lead to greater investment that will, over the long term, reduce power prices. But this government keeps moving the goalposts. So it's hard to sign up to a neg when we don't know exactly what the neg is going to be. But what's very clear is if the neg, as constructed, gets through Parliament with a 26% target, that means zero renewables for an entire decade. Not a single new large-scale renewable energy project will be built. In fact, the government's own modelling found that only 4 wind turbines will be added in a decade. 4 wind turbines in a decade, not 4 wind farms. That's less than what we're adding each week now. So we can hopefully reach agreement on the framework, but we need to be fair dinkum about the target, and it's pretty hard when Malcolm Turnbull can't even get his inadequate target through his party room.
Craig, is this taking its toll on Malcolm Turnbull's leadership? We've had rumblings about potential pressures on his leadership. Peter Dutton, the Immigration Minister, has come out this morning on social media saying that, just to make very clear, the Prime Minister has his full support. Does the Prime Minister have the full support of his government?
Look, I'm sure that he does, and I still support the Prime Minister. I'm there, and we are debating this. This is what our job is as members of Parliament, to have these debates, to have these discussions. This, I said, this is a strength on the coalition side about how we do about policy. Yes, it may look a little bit untidy from the outside, but vigorous debate looks untidy. Now Pat talks about, there'll be no new investment in renewables. If these renewables are so much cheaper, Pat, why would there be no new investment in them? This is why you don't need an artificial construct, Pat. When you artificially force, when you interfere in the market and you artificially force generation capacity in there, especially intermittent generation, that is what forces prices up. That is the experience not only all around the world, but here in South Australia. Highest renewable energy target in the country, and guess what? They've got the highest electricity prices, not only in the country, but by many measures, the highest in the world.
All right, let's move to the other big issue of the week, the maiden speech, and very controversial speech by Senator Fraser Anning. Pat, I asked your colleague Ed Husick a little earlier, should the Labor Party place the Katter Australia Party last in its preferences? He said, well, yes, I think they should. What's your view?
Well, I think, quite frankly, it's a hard choice of which to place last now, because we've got extremists in the Katter Party, we've got extremists in the One Nation, and my view is they should be last and second last, depending on what is the order. But I agree with Ed. We cannot tolerate such racist attacks, such bigotry in Australia. It has no place, and I applaud the response from both the Labor Party and Liberal politicians on this issue. But I do challenge my Liberal colleagues that they need to go a step further and stop their dog whistling, because while they attacked this overt exercising bigotry, they still do very many things that give licence to this sort of behaviour by demonising Sudanese Australians, amongst others. So they should match our actions and put One Nation and Bob Katter last in how to vote, because ultimately, if you don't do that, you're endorsing this attitude.
Pat, Craig, what do you say to that? Obviously, there was bipartisan condemnation of this week, but has politics, do you think, created a culture where these kinds of comments can fly?
Well, I think Fraser Anning has been condemned for his words. I think they were either very poorly chosen, and he should have stood up and apologised for them. And if he actually meant what he did with that reference to the final solution, if that was intentionally put in there, well, that's outrageous.
Do you think it was intentional?
Look, I would hope. I have a sort of look at the good nature in people first, and I find it difficult to accept that anyone knowing how that would be interpreted would deliberately put that in the speech. That would be absolutely disgraceful if they did. I hope that it was just an oversight that he did, but yet again, he hasn't, as I understand, he hasn't actually apologised for it, which
Aside
is
from
disappointing.
that phrase that he used, you would have many Muslims in your electorate.
Yeah.
How would they be feeling? Are they under assault?
Look, I don't. You have these extreme elements that make these comments, which I think is disappointing. But look, we've got people from all walks of life and all religions in this country that make a wonderful, wonderful contribution. And I find generally around the country, it doesn't matter what background you come from or what is your race or your religion. If you get on and you get on with work and get on with living in society, you are accepted by 99.9% of Australians.
Pat, what do you make of the attention given to this week? Obviously, we had a lot of talk about it in politics and in the general public, but was the very intention of the speech, according to reports, was to create controversy and to make inflammatory remarks. Do you think we should have potentially ignored it or called it out?
Oh, look, it's a very hard decision to make, and I think everyone did the right thing by calling it out. Unfortunately, that gives him the attention and flames his support amongst extremists, but you cannot stay silent on these issues. And it's not just the use of that abhorrent term final solution. This is a guy who called for the return of the White Australia policy. This is a man who said that every single terrorist in the world is a Muslim. This is a man who called for prejudice based on people's religious views. That's unacceptable. We need to call it out, and I think people did the right thing by doing that, because otherwise, if you don't stand up to this bigotry and extremism, it gets further licence. But we need to go further. As I said before, we need to put One Nation, and in my view, Bob Katter's party, last and second last in how to vote, because otherwise you're endorsing this extremist attitude. John Howard did it in the late 90s. He stood up to Pauline Hanson, and I think that stands to the credit of the Liberal Party. I think we all need to stand up to One Nation and Bob Katter now, rather than getting into bed with them. Unfortunately, that's what we see too often from the Coalition and other actions such as demonising Sudanese Australians in Melbourne and other places, for example.
Pat Conroy, Craig Kelly, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, Fraser Anning's inflammatory comments about race provoked outrage and sparked a national conversation about Australia's sometimes fraught history with migrant groups. And recently, the intense